What if the worst night of your life quietly became the reason you finally learned what home really felt like? My name is Ethan Brooks, and if you had met me a year ago, you probably would have thought I had everything under control. I was 27 years old, lived alone in a small apartment on the east side of Portland, and spent my days illustrating children's books that were filled with smiling animals, colorful forests, and happy endings I secretly wished existed outside the pages I painted. My neighbors knew me as the quiet artist who always carried a sketchbook and never missed the Saturday farmers market. My publisher described me as dependable. My parents believed I was doing well because every phone call ended with me saying the same thing. Everything is fine. The truth was that my apartment often felt much larger after the sun went down. Silence has a strange way of becoming louder when there is no one left to share it with. I had become very good at convincing other people that I enjoyed living alone. But there is a difference between enjoying solitude and becoming trapped inside it. That rainy Thursday night in October started like any other. I finished coloring the final pages of a picture book, reheated leftover tomato soup, and watched raindrops race down the living room window while soft jazz played in the background. Around 2 in the morning, I finally turned off the lights and headed toward my bedroom, expecting another ordinary night. Then I heard it. At first it sounded like nothing more than an old building settling against the wind, but a few seconds later the sound came again. Someone was trying the doorknob to my apartment. I froze where I stood. My heart immediately began racing as every possible explanation rushed through my mind. Maybe someone had the wrong apartment. Maybe it was another tenant. Maybe I was imagining everything. Then the handle moved once more, slowly enough that I knew I had not imagined it. I stepped backward without making a sound, and reached for my phone with hands that suddenly felt much colder than the room around me. My thumb hovered over the screen for only a second before I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered with a calm voice that somehow made breathing easier. She asked simple questions, and I answered as quietly as I could while keeping my eyes fixed on the front door. She assured me officers were already nearby and told me to remain inside until they arrived. The minutes that followed felt much longer than they probably were. Every creak of the building seemed amplified by the silence. Then, just as suddenly as the noise had begun, it stopped. A few moments later, there was a firm but gentle knock on my door. "Portland Police." A steady voice called from the hallway. "You are safe to open the door." I unlocked it carefully. Standing there beneath the soft hallway lights was a young police officer who looked calm enough to slow the entire night around him. His name tag read Mason Carter. Rain still clung to the shoulders of his navy jacket, and although he had clearly come in a hurry, there was nothing rushed about the way he spoke. He asked if I was all right before looking down the hallway, checking nearby doors, and quietly speaking with another officer outside my view. After several minutes, he returned and explained that another tenant had accidentally tried the wrong apartment after coming home late. Everything had been resolved peacefully, and there was no danger. Relief washed over me so quickly that I almost laughed at myself for overreacting. "I am sorry you had to come out here for something so small," I admitted, embarrassed. Mason shook his head with a gentle smile that somehow felt genuine instead of rehearsed. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," he said. "Sometimes the hardest part is not what actually happens. It is convincing yourself that you are safe after it is over." I looked at him for a moment without knowing why those words landed somewhere much deeper than I expected. He wished me a peaceful night before turning toward the stairwell, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. I closed my apartment door, leaned against it, and listened to the rain outside. At the time, I believed the frightening part of the night had ended. I had absolutely no way of knowing that the brief conversation with the officer who had answered my call was only the beginning of a story that would slowly change every ordinary day that followed. 8 weeks passed before I saw Officer Mason Carter again, and by then I had convinced myself that the strange feeling left behind by our brief conversation had simply become another memory tucked between ordinary days. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. I spent my mornings sketching woodland animals for my latest children's book, answered emails from my editor in the afternoon, and wandered through Portland whenever I needed inspiration. Saturday mornings still belonged to the neighborhood farmers market, while weekday afternoons usually ended with a stop at the same quiet coffee shop a few blocks from my apartment. It was the kind of place where nobody hurried anyone out the door, where the smell of fresh espresso mixed with the scent of cinnamon pastries, and where people often sat for hours reading novels or working on laptops beneath warm hanging lights. One cool November afternoon, I was standing near the pickup counter waiting for my vanilla latte when someone beside me said, "I had a feeling you would order the same thing again." I turned in surprise and immediately recognized the familiar calm blue eyes before I even noticed the rest of him. Mason stood there wearing a navy jacket instead of his police uniform, a light blue button-up shirt underneath, and the relaxed smile of someone who had not expected the encounter to feel quite so pleasant. For a brief second, I forgot how to answer. "You remembered me," I finally said. He gave a small shrug. "I remember people more often than coffee orders." Then he smiled a little wider. Although apparently, I remembered both. I laughed before I realized I was laughing, and the awkwardness between strangers disappeared much faster than I expected. We collected our drinks and stepped aside so other customers could reach the counter. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, but inside the cafe, everything felt warm enough to make time slow down. "How have you been?" he asked. "Better," I answered honestly. "The apartment has been much quieter lately." "That is good to hear." There was a comfortable pause before he looked at the sketchbook tucked beneath my arm. "Still drawing?" I opened it without thinking and showed him a watercolor illustration of a young fox sitting beneath a giant cedar tree. Mason studied the page with surprising attention instead of offering the quick compliments most people gave. "He looks brave," he said after a moment. I smiled. "Really? Most people say he looks lonely." Mason tilted his head slightly. "Maybe he is both. Sometimes courage is just loneliness that keeps moving forward." His observation caught me off guard because it somehow described more than the drawing itself. We ended up sitting together near the front window after discovering neither of us had anywhere urgent to be. The conversation flowed with an ease that felt unusual between two people who had technically only met once. I learned that Mason was 29 years old and had grown up outside Portland before joining the police department. He told me he hoped to complete additional crisis intervention training because he believed some of the most important moments in police work began with listening instead of talking. I admitted that illustrating children's books had been my dream since college, even though I still worried every project might be my last. Instead of dismissing those fears, Mason simply listened with the same quiet patience I remembered from that rainy night. At one point, he reached into his wallet and handed me a small card. It listed several local mental wellness resources along with community events organized by the crisis intervention team. "You probably will never need this," he said gently, "but sometimes knowing help exists makes carrying difficult days a little easier." I looked at the card before slipping it carefully into my wallet instead of my pocket. "Thank you. You do not have to thank me." He smiled into his coffee cup. "I just figured you were the kind of person who keeps taking care of everyone else before remembering yourself." I stared at him, surprised by how accurately he had described me after such limited time together. We remained at the cafe nearly an hour discussing favorite books, rainy weather, and why Portland somehow looked more beautiful in November than it did in the middle of summer. Eventually, Mason glanced at his watch and stood. I should probably head out before I convince myself this counts as a day off. We walked toward the door together. Just before leaving, he looked back with that same calm expression I had carried in my memory ever since the night we met. "It was good seeing you again, Ethan." Hearing my name spoken so naturally made me pause. I had never told him my name that afternoon. Then I remembered. He had learned it during the emergency call weeks earlier and somehow never forgotten it. As I watched him disappear into the light rain beyond the cafe windows, I found myself wondering why a man who must meet hundreds of people every month had remembered one quiet illustrator from a single rainy night. And for reasons I could not yet explain, I realized I genuinely hoped that our second meeting would not be our last. Early December settled gently over Portland, bringing crisp mornings, glowing holiday lights, and the familiar comfort of coffee shops that seemed even warmer than usual. I did not expect to see Mason again so soon. Yet somehow our paths kept crossing in ways that felt too ordinary to be called coincidence and too frequent to ignore. The first time happened at the Saturday farmers market when I was debating whether I really needed another loaf of fresh sourdough bread. "You always look like buying bread is a life-changing decision," a familiar voice said from behind me. I turned and found Mason standing there with a canvas grocery bag over one shoulder, smiling as though this meeting had simply become part of his weekend. "It is," I replied. Good bread deserves careful consideration. He laughed quietly. Then I should probably leave you alone to think. Instead, we ended up walking through the market together. He introduced me to a honey vendor he had been visiting for years, while I convinced him to sample blueberry jam from a local farm. We spent nearly an hour wandering among flower stands, handmade pottery, and rows of fresh produce, talking about everything except the reasons we had first met. The conversations came naturally now. We argued playfully about whether rainy days were better for reading or painting, debated which bakery made the best cinnamon rolls in Portland, and discovered we both believed bookstores were impossible to leave without buying something. Before we realized it, the market vendors were already beginning to pack away their displays. You know, Mason said as we reached the parking lot, this is the third conversation we have had that lasted much longer than either of us planned. I smiled. Maybe we both underestimate how much we like talking. He looked away for a second, almost embarrassed by how true that sounded. During the following weeks, those unexpected meetings slowly turned into intentional ones. Sometimes Mason would send a simple message asking whether I wanted coffee after work. Other times I invited him to walk through Forest Park whenever I needed a break from drawing. We never labeled those afternoons as dates because neither of us seemed interested in rushing toward definitions. Instead, we simply learned each other's routines one ordinary day at a time. I discovered that Mason always removed his watch before eating because he disliked the feeling of metal against the table. He learned that I carried colored pencils almost everywhere because inspiration rarely arrived on schedule. One chilly afternoon, we stopped beside a small bookstore decorated with evergreen wreaths for the holidays. While I browsed the children's section, Mason wandered toward the local history shelves. A few minutes later, he returned holding a picture book about foxes native to the Pacific Northwest. Research, he said with complete seriousness before handing it to me. I laughed. You realize I already draw foxes. Exactly, he replied. Now you can make them scientifically accurate. That became one of my favorite jokes between us. A week later, I surprised him by bringing homemade blueberry muffins to the coffee shop. Professional research requires proper snacks, I explained. He accepted one with exaggerated gratitude before taking a bite. These might be good enough to distract me during paperwork. That sounds like a dangerous endorsement. It probably is. We laughed so easily together that even the barista behind the counter eventually greeted us as though we always arrived as a pair. As December moved closer to Christmas, Portland seemed wrapped in soft lights and quiet anticipation. One evening, Mason invited me to a small holiday market organized by a neighborhood community center. Children decorated cookies while volunteers collected winter coats for local families. Mason spent nearly half an hour helping an elderly man carry donated boxes inside before returning with the same calm smile that seemed to appear whenever he was helping someone. Watching him move through the room without expecting recognition made me understand something important. Kindness was not something he performed when people were watching. It was simply part of who he was. Before we left, the event coordinator asked whether anyone with artistic experience would be interested in painting a mural for the children's reading corner after the holidays. I hesitated, uncertain whether I had enough time to volunteer. Mason looked toward me with quiet encouragement, but said nothing. He never pushed me toward decisions. He simply believed I was capable of making them. I signed my name before I could change my mind. As we walked back through the cold evening air, carrying hot chocolate from a nearby stand, Mason glanced toward the community center behind us. I think those kids are going to love whatever you create. I looked down at my cup before answering honestly. Sometimes I worry that what I make is never quite enough. He slowed his pace until we were walking shoulder to shoulder beneath strings of holiday lights. Ethan, he said softly, the people who need kindness the most rarely remember whether something was perfect. They remember how it made them feel. I carried those words home with me that night. And somewhere between finishing another illustration, sharing another cup of coffee, and taking another walk through familiar streets beside him, I realized that Mason was quietly becoming someone I looked forward to seeing, not because extraordinary things happened whenever we were together, but because even the most ordinary moments somehow felt brighter. When he was there, the first winter storm of January arrived with very little warning. Portland woke beneath dark clouds that seemed determined to empty themselves before sunset, and by late afternoon the rain had turned into a relentless mixture of freezing wind and heavy showers that rattled every window in the city. I had spent most of the day sketching ideas for the community center mural when Mason sent a simple message asking if I was still planning to paint that evening. I looked outside at the weather and laughed before replying that even the squirrels had probably canceled their plans. A few minutes later he answered, "Then I will bring coffee instead." He arrived carrying 2 steaming cups and a paper bag filled with grilled cheese sandwiches from a neighborhood cafe that somehow remained open during every storm Portland ever experienced. We spread my sketches across the living room floor, debating colors for friendly foxes, tall cedar trees, and cheerful woodland scenes that might make children smile while choosing their next book. Mason insisted that every forest needed at least one curious owl. I argued that the fox deserved the spotlight. By the end of the evening, the owl had quietly found a branch in the background, and the fox remained the obvious hero. Outside, the weather only became worse. Wind shook the apartment building while rain struck the windows so hard that the city beyond them slowly disappeared into a blur of gray. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and finally went out completely. The apartment fell into silence except for the steady rhythm of rain. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, while Mason located a box of candles that I had almost forgotten I owned. Soon small flames filled the room with warm light that pushed back the darkness just enough to make everything feel unexpectedly peaceful. Without televisions, computers, or phones competing for attention, conversations seemed to come more naturally than ever before. We sat on the living room floor beside the coffee table, wrapped in blankets while candlelight danced across the walls. Mason asked about the first picture I had ever drawn. I admitted it had been a crooked dinosaur that my mother proudly displayed on the refrigerator for years. I asked him why he had become a police officer. He took a long moment before answering. "When I was a teenager, someone treated my family with incredible patience during a difficult time," he said quietly. I realized later that kindness can change how people remember the hardest days of their lives. I wanted to become that kind of person for someone else. I looked at him in the soft candlelight and understood why his words had stayed with me ever since the night we met. They were never rehearsed. They came from experience. Eventually, the conversation became quieter. I admitted something I rarely told anyone. Sometimes I worry that I spend so much time creating happy endings because I am afraid I will never have one myself. Mason did not rush to disagree. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "I think you create them because deep down you still believe people deserve them. That is not weakness, Ethan. That is hope." I felt something inside me become unexpectedly lighter. Hours slipped by while the storm continued outside. Around midnight, Mason checked the weather on his phone and frowned slightly. Several roads had been temporarily closed because of fallen trees and flooding. "I probably should not try driving across town tonight," he admitted. "You are welcome to stay here," I answered before I had time to overthink it. The couch pulls out into a bed. We both laughed a few minutes later when the aging mechanism refused to unfold no matter how carefully we tried. After several determined attempts, the metal frame jammed completely. "I think your couch officially retired," Mason joked. I shook my head. It picked a dramatic night to do it. The apartment had only one real bed, a queen-sized mattress with plenty of room for 2 adults to sleep comfortably. There was nothing awkward about the decision, only practical reality. We gathered extra pillows and blankets, changed into comfortable sleep clothes, and settled beneath the covers fully dressed in clean t-shirts and sweatpants, leaving a respectful space between us. The room remained softly lit by one candle resting safely on the dresser until it finally burned low enough for us to extinguish it. Rain continued tapping gently against the windows. For a while neither of us spoke. Then Mason broke the silence with a quiet laugh. "You know, this is definitely not how I expected my day to end." I smiled into the darkness. "Mine either." Another comfortable silence followed before he said, "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me stay." I turned slightly toward him, barely able to make out his outline in the dim room. "The truth is," I admitted softly, "I think I started trusting you long before I realized it." Neither of us tried to say anything more after that. There was no need. Outside, the storm slowly drifted farther into the distance, and inside the apartment, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the quiet no longer felt lonely. It simply felt shared. Early the next morning, the storm had finally moved east, leaving Portland wrapped in a quiet layer of fresh rainwater that reflected pale winter sunlight across the streets. I woke before my alarm and, for a brief second, forgot that someone else was in the apartment. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of cabinet doors opening and quietly closing in the kitchen, followed by a low laugh that sounded more amused than frustrated. I walked out to find Mason standing in front of my French press with complete determination and absolutely no success. "I am beginning to think this thing requires a license," he admitted while holding the instruction booklet upside down. I smiled for what felt like the 100th time around him. "You arrest criminals, but a coffee maker defeats you?" He looked at me with exaggerated seriousness. "Everyone has weaknesses." A few minutes later, we were sitting at the small kitchen table with fresh coffee, toast, and the last slices of grilled cheese reheated in a skillet. Nothing about the breakfast was remarkable, yet somehow it became one of those ordinary moments that stayed with me much longer than I expected. Before leaving, Mason noticed one corner of my old bookshelf leaning slightly away from the wall. Without saying anything, he found a screwdriver in my kitchen drawer, tightened the loose screws, adjusted one uneven leg with a folded piece of cardboard, and stepped back with quiet satisfaction. "There," he said. "Your foxes deserve stable shelves." I laughed. "You know, most people would never even notice that." He shrugged. "Maybe. But once you notice something that can be fixed, it is difficult to pretend you did not." After he left, I looked around my apartment and realized nothing dramatic had changed. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. My sketches still covered the dining table. The rain continued falling softly outside, yet the space somehow felt warmer than it had the day before. Over the following weeks, our lives continued weaving together through dozens of small routines that never seemed important individually, but slowly became impossible to separate from everyday life. Every Wednesday evening, we volunteered at the community center to work on the children's reading corner. I painted towering cedar trees, smiling woodland animals, winding forest trails, and colorful birds, while Mason helped volunteers assemble bookshelves, organize donated books, and carry supplies between rooms. Children often wandered in before we finished, asking endless questions about the fox wearing a blue scarf in the center of the mural. Mason always invented elaborate stories about the fox before looking toward me with a grin that suggested I should probably make those stories official someday. Watching him kneel beside curious children with endless patience somehow made me admire him even more than I already did. One afternoon, my editor called with encouraging news. The publisher wanted another round of revisions because they believed my manuscript had real potential for release later that year. There was still plenty of work ahead, but for the first time the possibility felt real instead of distant. When I told Mason later that evening, he smiled as though the accomplishment belonged to both of us. "That deserves celebrating," he announced. "Nothing extravagant, just dinner." We ended up eating at a small family-owned Thai restaurant tucked into one of Portland's quieter neighborhoods. Halfway through the meal, the server unexpectedly placed a slice of chocolate cake in front of me. I looked at Mason in confusion. "You planned this?" He tried to appear innocent, but failed almost immediately. "You finished something difficult," he said. "Waiting until everything is perfect before celebrating seems like a terrible habit." I laughed, shaking my head. "You really do find reasons to celebrate everything." "Not everything," he replied softly. "Just the things people forget to celebrate for themselves." His answer stayed with me long after the cake was gone. As winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, our conversations expanded beyond work and hobbies. We talked about childhood dreams, family traditions, favorite road trips, books that had changed us, and the quiet fears we rarely admitted out loud. I learned that Mason dreamed of eventually helping expand community mental health outreach within the police department because he believed prevention mattered just as much as emergency response. He learned that my greatest fear was not failure itself, but creating a life that felt emotionally small because I had spent too much time protecting myself from disappointment. Neither of us tried to solve the other's worries. We simply listened. Looking back, I think that was when something quietly shifted between us. We were no longer just finding time to meet. We had gradually become part of each other's ordinary routines without ever making a formal decision for that to happen. Sometimes he texted to remind me to eat lunch when deadlines consumed my afternoon. Sometimes I left fresh blueberry muffins outside his apartment before an early morning shift because I knew he often skipped breakfast. Those gestures were small enough that neither of us ever mentioned them afterward, yet they carried a quiet meaning words never quite captured. One evening, After finishing another long session at the community center, we stood outside watching the sunset reflect across the Willamette River. Mason looked toward the skyline before saying, almost absent-mindedly, "Funny how some places only start feeling like home after the right people become part of them." I looked at the fading light, then back at him, and realized I no longer measured home by the apartment where I slept or the neighborhood where I worked. Without noticing exactly when it had happened, I had begun measuring it by the quiet certainty that somewhere in this city there was someone who always seemed to make even the most ordinary day feel a little brighter. By the middle of March, Portland had traded gray winter skies for cool mornings filled with blooming cherry trees, and life seemed to gather speed without asking either of us whether we were ready. The mural at the community center had become a favorite corner for children. My editor was sending revisions more frequently as my first book moved closer to publication, and Mason had officially begun the most demanding stage of his crisis intervention training. I was proud of him from the moment he told me the news over coffee, but I could also see the exhaustion hidden behind his familiar smile. The additional classes, simulations, paperwork, and longer shifts left him with very little free time. And for the first time since we had met, our routines no longer fit together as naturally as they once had. At first, neither of us thought much about it. We continued exchanging short messages throughout the day. Sometimes he wished me luck before an important meeting with my editor. Sometimes I reminded him to eat something besides vending machine snacks during long training sessions. We still talked, but conversations that once lasted an hour slowly became a few thoughtful sentences sent between responsibilities. One Saturday morning, I stopped by our usual coffee shop out of habit and automatically ordered 2 drinks before realizing Mason had texted me an hour earlier explaining that an unexpected training exercise had been added to his schedule. I stood there holding both cups for several quiet seconds before handing the extra latte to a college student searching for a place to study. She thanked me with a surprised smile, and I smiled back, but the empty chair across from mine remained impossible to ignore. It was a small disappointment, almost too ordinary to mention, yet it lingered longer than I expected. Over the following weeks, those tiny moments quietly accumulated. We canceled walks because one of us was working late. We postponed dinner because deadlines refused to cooperate. More than once I finished painting until nearly midnight, only to realize I had forgotten to answer one of Mason's messages from earlier that afternoon. He always replied with understanding instead of frustration, which somehow made me feel even guiltier. The strange thing was that nothing had actually gone wrong between us. There were no arguments, no misunderstandings, and no harsh words. Life had simply become crowded, leaving less room for the quiet routines that had once held us together. One rainy evening, I finished another round of illustration revisions and found myself walking alone beside the Willamette River. Without thinking, I sent Mason a message asking whether he happened to be nearby. 10 minutes later, he replied that he had just finished training across town and could meet me if I did not mind waiting. I stayed. When he finally arrived nearly half an hour later, he looked more tired than I had ever seen him. Dark circles rested beneath his blue eyes. Yet the moment he noticed me, his expression softened into the same gentle smile that had first greeted me outside my apartment months earlier. We began walking along the river without any particular destination. For several minutes, we simply listened to the water moving beneath the bridges. Eventually, I decided honesty was kinder than pretending everything felt normal. "I miss how easy this used to be," I admitted quietly. Mason lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "So do I." There was no defensiveness in his voice, only the simple truth. "I keep telling myself this training is temporary," he continued. "But I also know that temporary things can still make people feel lonely if we are not careful." I nodded because I understood exactly what he meant. I was afraid saying something would make me sound selfish. He looked at me with gentle surprise. "Ethan, wanting time with someone you care about is never selfish." We stopped beside the railing overlooking the river where the evening lights shimmered across the water. Mason rested his hands against the cool metal before speaking again. "Can I tell you something I have been learning?" I smiled. "Of course." During training, they remind us that people often assume silence means everything is fine. Most of the time, silence just means nobody knows how to begin the conversation. His words settled between us with familiar, quiet wisdom. I laughed softly. "It seems you are still teaching me things, even when you are exhausted." He smiled. "Only because you keep teaching me too." We stood there watching a small ferry glide across the river before I finally asked the question that had been quietly sitting in my heart for weeks. Promise me that when life becomes busy again, we will tell each other the truth instead of guessing what the other person is thinking. Mason answered without hesitation. I promise. We ask. We do not assume. I held out my hand with a playful grin. That sounds official enough to deserve an agreement. Instead of laughing at me, he shook my hand with complete seriousness before both of us smiled at the absurdity of making a friendship contract on a rainy river walk. Yet somehow that simple gesture mattered. As we walked back toward the city beneath rows of glowing streetlights, I realized that strong relationships were not protected by perfect schedules or endless free time. They survived because two ordinary people kept choosing honest conversations before quiet distance had the chance to grow into something much harder to cross. Early April arrived with longer afternoons, blooming cherry trees, and the kind of gentle sunshine that made Portland feel as though it had quietly forgiven another rainy winter. Mason finally completed the most demanding portion of his crisis intervention training, and although his schedule remained busy, I could immediately see the difference in him. The tired look that had followed him for weeks had begun to disappear, replaced once again by the calm confidence that had first made me feel safe on the night we met. One Friday evening, my phone buzzed with a message that simply read, "I think I finally remembered what a free evening feels like. Coffee tomorrow?" I smiled before I even realized I was smiling and replied yes. Almost immediately, the next morning he was already waiting outside our favorite coffee shop, holding 2 cups exactly the way he always did. "You are early," I said. He shook his head with a grin. "No, you are late by 2 minutes." I looked at my watch. "That is impossible." He held up his own watch with exaggerated confidence. "Police time." I laughed and accepted my vanilla latte while we began walking toward the Saturday farmers market. Nothing about the morning was extraordinary. We sampled local honey, debated which bakery made the best sourdough bread, and listened to a street musician playing acoustic guitar near the flower stands. Yet every ordinary moment felt strangely meaningful because we had almost forgotten what it was like to spend an entire day without checking the time. At one booth, an elderly woman selling handmade scarves insisted that Mason needed more color in his wardrobe. He politely explained that navy blue was practically part of his job description, but she ignored his argument and wrapped a forest green scarf around his shoulders anyway. I could not stop laughing. "You actually look good in it," I admitted. Mason sighed dramatically. Now I have no defense. Before we left, he quietly bought the scarf without telling me until we were already halfway across the market. "I thought Navy deserved a friend," he joked. That afternoon, we carried groceries back to my apartment and decided to cook lunch instead of ordering takeout. Mason confidently announced that he could handle homemade pasta, a statement that lasted exactly 10 minutes before flowers somehow covered the kitchen counter, the floor, and one side of his jacket. I leaned against the refrigerator laughing so hard that I could barely breathe. "I thought you said you knew what you were doing." He looked down at the mess and nodded thoughtfully. "I do. I am creating modern art." We eventually admitted defeat and made simple pasta with store-bought noodles instead. Somehow it still tasted perfect. After lunch, we walked to the community center to check on the Reading Corner mural before the official spring literacy event. Several children were already sitting beneath the painted cedar trees reading books aloud to one another. A little girl pointed toward the fox wearing the blue scarf and asked if he had a best friend. Before I could answer, Mason knelt beside her and smiled gently. "I think he does," he said. "How can you tell?" she asked. Mason looked toward the painted forest for a moment before replying. "Because he looks much braver than he did at the beginning." I glanced at him without saying anything. Somehow he had described more than a painted fox. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was my editor calling with exciting news. The publisher wanted to schedule the final illustration review because everything was moving toward publication faster than expected. My first reaction was excitement. My second was panic. What if they decide it still is not good enough? I asked after ending the call. Mason rested against the railing outside the community center and folded his arms comfortably. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "If another illustrator had worked as hard as you have, would you believe they deserved this opportunity?" "Of course," I answered immediately. "Then why is it so much harder to believe that about yourself?" I opened my mouth to answer, but found nothing. The silence itself became my answer. Mason smiled kindly instead of waiting for an explanation. Sometimes confidence grows by borrowing someone else's belief until your own finally catches up. We began walking toward the river as the afternoon slowly turned into evening. Families filled the parks, bicycles rolled past us, and spring flowers lined the sidewalks. Everything felt peaceful in a way that only ordinary Saturdays ever seemed to manage. As we crossed a small pedestrian bridge, I stopped walking and leaned against the railing overlooking the water. "Do you ever think about how strange all of this is?" I asked quietly. Mason looked at the river before looking back at me. "Meeting because of one unexpected night?" I nodded. He smiled with that familiar calm expression that somehow always appeared exactly when I needed it. "I think about something different," he said. "What is that?" He looked toward the fading sunlight reflecting across the river. "I think about how easy it would have been for both of us to treat that night as the end of a story. Instead, we kept choosing another conversation, another cup of coffee, another ordinary day. That is usually how the best parts of life begin." As we continued walking beneath the warm evening sky, I realized he was right. Nothing extraordinary had brought us to that moment. Hundreds of ordinary choices had quietly done the work instead, one simple day at a time. By the end of April, the city seemed brighter than it had any right to be. Dogwood trees lined quiet streets with white blossoms, outdoor cafes filled with laughter, and the cool breeze drifting through Portland carried the unmistakable promise of summer waiting just around the corner. My final illustration review with the publisher was scheduled for the following week, while the community center had announced the official opening celebration for the Children's Reading Corner we had spent months creating together. Everything felt as though it was moving toward a new chapter, yet instead of making me anxious, it filled me with a quiet sense of gratitude. One Saturday morning, Mason knocked on my apartment door, carrying a small paper bag from the bakery we both loved. "I figured important weeks deserve cinnamon rolls," he said. "You really do celebrate everything," I replied with a smile. "Not everything," he answered, repeating words I had heard months earlier. "Only the things people are too busy to celebrate themselves." We ate breakfast on the apartment balcony while the neighborhood slowly woke around us. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk below, someone nearby practiced the piano with the windows open, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the air. The silence between us no longer needed filling. It had become comfortable, the kind of silence built from trust instead of uncertainty. Later that afternoon, we walked to the community center for the opening celebration. The reading corner looked even more inviting than I remembered. Sunlight poured through the large windows onto the mural, making the painted cedar trees appear almost alive. The fox wearing the blue scarf still smiled from the center of the forest, while Mason's owl watched quietly from its favorite branch. Families filled the room. Children immediately settled onto colorful rugs with books in their hands, and volunteers smiled as they watched months of work become something real. The event coordinator thanked everyone who had contributed before inviting me to say a few words about the mural. Public speaking had never been my strength, but I accepted anyway. I looked around the room before saying that stories often begin because someone chooses kindness during an ordinary day, and that I hoped every child sitting beneath those painted trees would someday discover a story that reminded them they were never truly alone. When I finished, the applause felt warm rather than overwhelming. As I stepped away from the microphone, Mason quietly squeezed my shoulder for just a second. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to everyone else. Yet somehow it steadied me more than any speech ever could. After the celebration, we wandered through the nearby park, carrying iced coffee, while children played beneath fresh green trees. We found an empty bench overlooking a small pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. For several minutes, we simply watched the afternoon unfold around us. Finally, Mason spoke. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" I laughed softly. "Probably an apology." "It was," he admitted with a grin. "You kept apologizing for calling 911. I looked down at my coffee cup. I really believed I had wasted your time." Mason slowly shook his head. "You never wasted it." His voice carried the same calm certainty I remembered from that first rainy night. I have thought about that call more than once over the past several months. I turned toward him with quiet curiosity. "Why?" He watched the sunlight ripple across the pond before answering. "Because I realized something. That night I thought I was responding to someone who needed reassurance for a few minutes. I never imagined I was meeting someone who would quietly become one of the most important people in my everyday life. The world around us seemed to grow wonderfully still. Children continued laughing in the distance. Birds moved through the branches overhead, and somewhere nearby a musician played gentle guitar melodies. Yet all of it faded behind the simple honesty of his words. I smiled before speaking because I wanted him to see exactly how much they meant to me. I have been trying to figure out when everything changed, I admitted. I thought maybe it happened during the storm or while painting the mural or somewhere between all those cups of coffee. Mason smiled warmly. Maybe it was never one moment. I nodded slowly. Maybe it was every ordinary moment added together. He looked at me for a long second before quietly reaching over and taking my hand. There was nothing dramatic about the gesture. It felt as natural as every conversation, every shared meal, every walk beside the river, and every quiet morning that had slowly brought us here. I gently held his hand in return, and neither of us felt the need to rush toward bigger promises. The peace of that simple connection was already enough. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the pond, I realized the future no longer felt like something I faced alone. Whatever came next, whether it brought joyful surprises or difficult seasons, I knew there was someone beside me who would keep choosing another conversation, another shared day, and another quiet reason to believe that home could be found in the steady presence of another heart. By the middle of May, Portland seemed to breathe a little more slowly. The rain visited less often, neighborhood gardens burst into color, and every familiar street somehow carried memories that had quietly accumulated over the past several months. My first children's book had officially gone to print. The community center reading corner had become one of the busiest spaces in the building, and Mason had completed his crisis intervention training with recognition from both his instructors and fellow officers for the patience and compassion he brought into every conversation. We celebrated neither accomplishment with anything extravagant. Instead, we returned to the same coffee shop where we had unexpectedly met after that unforgettable emergency call. Months earlier, the same barista smiled as we walked in together. "Your usual order?" she asked. Mason answered before I could. "Vanilla latte for Ethan. Black coffee for me." She laughed. "Some things never change." I smiled because she was only partly right. Our coffee order had stayed the same, but almost everything else had quietly transformed. We carried our drinks to the corner table beside the window where spring sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. Mason reached into his backpack and placed a neatly wrapped package in front of me. "You are celebrating today too," I said. "I thought we agreed not to make a big deal out of things." He smiled with familiar amusement. "This is not a big deal. Open it." Inside the paper was a simple wooden picture frame. Behind the glass was not an award or a photograph, but the very first sketch I had ever shown him at the cafe months ago, the little fox that he had called Brave. I stared at it for several quiet seconds before noticing something written in small letters beneath the drawing. Courage does not always look fearless. Sometimes it simply keeps showing up. I looked up at him, unable to find words immediately. "You kept this?" I asked softly. "You gave me a copy after our second coffee," he replied. "I thought it deserved a better place than a folder." I laughed quietly, shaking my head. "You remember everything." He shrugged. "Only the important things." A few days later, my publisher organized a small gathering to celebrate the upcoming release of the book. Friends, editors, local librarians, and community volunteers filled the bookstore with conversation and warm encouragement. Near the back of the room, I noticed several children from the community center pointing excitedly toward the illustrations displayed on the wall. One little boy recognized the fox wearing the blue scarf and proudly told his mother that he knew exactly where that fox lived. Mason stood beside me watching the children with the same gentle smile I had seen so many times before. "Looks like your research paid off," he whispered, reminding me of the old joke about scientifically accurate foxes. I laughed, and for a moment I realized how many memories were hidden inside the simplest conversations we had shared. After the event ended, we decided to walk instead of driving home. The evening air felt warm, and the streets glowed beneath the last light of sunset. Without planning it, our steps eventually brought us back to the apartment building where everything had begun. We stood quietly on the sidewalk looking toward the entrance. The building looked exactly as it had on that rainy October night. The brick walls had not changed. The hallway lights still glowed through the windows. Even the old maple tree beside the parking lot remained exactly where it had always been. I smiled softly. It feels strange standing here again. Mason nodded. The place stayed the same. I looked toward the front door before answering. We did not. He followed my gaze and smiled. No, we did not. For a few peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. I remembered the fear I had carried that night, the uncertainty after hearing someone at my door, the hesitation before calling for help, and the quiet police officer who had reminded me that feeling safe again sometimes took longer than the emergency itself. Back then, I believed that night had been nothing more than an interruption in an otherwise lonely life. I never imagined it had actually been the first page of a story that would gently change everything. I turned toward Mason and squeezed his hand. I used to think that call happened because I needed someone to help me through one frightening evening. He looked at me with patient curiosity. I smiled, feeling more certain than ever before. Now I know it happened because life had a much bigger plan than either of us could see. He laughed softly before answering. I think life usually hides the best chapters until people are ready to read them. We continued walking through the quiet neighborhood toward home, no longer wondering where the path might lead because we had already discovered what truly mattered. It had never been about one emergency call, one unexpected meeting, one storm, or one remarkable moment. It had been about every ordinary choice that followed. One conversation became another. One cup of coffee became countless shared mornings. One act of kindness became trust. Trust became friendship. Friendship slowly became love that asked for nothing dramatic, only honesty, patience, laughter, and the willingness to keep showing up even during ordinary days. As the evening settled gently over Portland, I realized the greatest surprise was never that the same officer answered my call. The greatest surprise was discovering that the person who first arrived to help me feel safe had quietly become the person who finally taught me what home truly felt like. And for the first time in many years, the future no longer looked uncertain. It looked peaceful because wherever the next chapter led, we would be walking into it together, one ordinary day at a time.